The most incendiary moment in 1973 did not begin with outrage. It began with laughter. The stage lights were hot, the room thick with cigarette smoke and expectation. A microphone stood at the center like a dare. George Carlin stepped into the light with the loose confidence of a man who had already shed one version of himself and was in the process of becoming another. Gone was the clean-cut television personality. In his place, sharper edges, longer hair, a voice tuned to discomfort. He leaned into the microphone. "I want to talk about something," he began, pacing slowly. "Something you're not supposed to talk about." The audience leaned in. Words. A pause. The ones you can't say. What followed was not just a joke. It was a dissection. Carlin didn't merely list words. He examined them, turned them over, questioned why certain sounds could provoke such visceral reactions. He spoke like a linguist with a rebel's grin, cataloging taboo as if it were a scientific specimen. The crowd roared, not just because it was funny, but because it felt forbidden. By 1972, Carlin had already captured the routine on his album Class Clown. On vinyl, the bit took on a different life. Portable, repeatable, impossible to contain within the walls of a single club. The words traveled, and with them the question, who decides what can be said? October 1973, New York. Inside a modest radio booth, a producer at Pacifica Foundation hesitated over a reel. "Daytime slot," someone muttered. Another voice replied, "It's art, it's commentary." A third voice, quieter, "It's trouble." The tape rolled anyway. Across the city, a man drove with his young son in the passenger seat. The radio murmured in the background, news, music, fragments of conversation. Then, Carlin's voice, clear, unfiltered, unapologetic. The father stiffened. The boy listened. By the time the car ride ended, a complaint had already begun forming. It would be written, filed, forwarded. A small private act, but institutions have a way of amplifying small things. The complaint reached the Federal Communications Commission. Inside its offices, the routine was no longer a joke. It was evidence. "This isn't about comedy," one official said, flipping through a transcript. "It's about broadcast standards." Another leaned back in his chair. "It's about control," he replied. The question was deceptively simple. Could the government regulate words, not ban them entirely, but decide when and how they could be heard? The FCC issued its response, a declaratory order, measured language masking a significant shift. The broadcast was deemed indecent, not illegal, but not free either. At the Pacifica Foundation, the reaction was immediate. "We challenge it," one executive said flatly. "It's protected speech." "Or it should be," another added. The case began its slow climb, from complaint to ruling to appeal, upward through the machinery of American law. For Carlin, the moment landed differently. Backstage one night, he lit a cigarette and laughed when someone mentioned the controversy. "All this," he said, exhaling smoke, "over a few words." But there was something else in his expression. Recognition. Because the joke had changed. By 1978, the question had reached the highest court in the land of land. The marble steps of the Supreme Court of the United States stood in stark contrast to the smoky clubs where the routine had been born. Inside, the case was formal, precise, stripped of laughter. FCC versus Pacifica Foundation. Lawyers spoke of precedent, of children, of public trust. The airwaves, one argument went, belong to the people. And the people, another countered, have the right to hear. Somewhere in the discussion, the words themselves lingered, unspoken now, but central to everything. The decision came down narrow, 5-4. The court upheld the FCC's authority, not to ban the words, but to regulate them, to decide their place, their timing, their reach. It was a subtle shift, but a powerful one. In studios across the country, the reaction was immediate. Producers installed delay systems, executives issued new guidelines, conversations changed tone. "Save it after 10, someone would say. "Don't risk it," another warned. The air grew cleaner and quieter. For comedians, the effect was tangible. Television doors narrowed. Jokes were reshaped, softened, or abandoned. The edge, the dangerous electric edge, had to be measured against consequence. Some called it caution. Others called it fear. To many performers, it felt like something else entirely, not a conspiracy in the shadowy sense, but an alignment. Regulators, public anxiety, corporate risk, all moving almost naturally towards the same conclusion: control the boundaries. And yet, the joke refused to disappear. If anything, it grew louder. George Carlin leaned into it. On stage, his voice sharpened. His observations cut deeper. "They don't like the words," he said in one performance, pacing with intensity, "but they'll tolerate the actions." The audience laughed, then paused, because beneath the humor was something heavier. The routine became legend, not just for its content, but for what it revealed. It exposed the mechanics behind the laughter, the invisible systems that shaped what could be heard, when, and by whom. Historically, the impact settled into structure: safe harbor hours, indecency standards, a legal distinction between broadcast and print that would ripple forward into future debates about media, technology, and speech. But culturally, it became something else: a symbol, a reminder that comedy is never just comedy, that a joke, told at the right moment, can collide with institutions powerful enough to reshape it. Years later, Carlin would reflect on the moment with characteristic clarity. "They were never just words," he said. "They were questions." And the country had answered. Not definitively, not permanently, but enough to draw a line. One that comedians, audiences, and regulators would continue to approach, test, and redraw. In the end, the story plays like one of Carlin's own routines. It starts light, builds tension, takes an unexpected turn, and somewhere along the way, the laughter catches in your throat, because behind the punchline is a system, behind the system a choice, and behind the choice a simple, enduring question: who gets to decide what can be said? The microphone still stands, the audience still listens, and the line, however carefully drawn, is always waiting to be crossed.